Good evening. How are you?
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. Antony and I, for the last several months, have been acutely interested in not only the work that we've been doing in looking at the gastrointestinal system and how incredibly important it is for overall health, but there's a burgeoning gathering of data and information and published research from around the globe today that's becoming quite interesting with this. And what I'll want to do is start by explaining to you that the gastrointestinal tract was the very first part of the human body that ever came about before we became humans. How many of you knew that? So if you can picture it, not quite what it looked like, but from the throat to the butt is what was the very first part of a human being. And what happened is that that was brought out from the biology of the earth itself. So the gathering of different microbes and the gathering of different bacteria and viruses created the human anatomy. And because we were the very first part, the gastrointestinal tract, it's actually where the epicenter of your immune system is, your great protector. So we're going to speak about that tonight, and each of us will make comments on it. We choose to do an equalitarian gathering. So your gut feeling.
So today, disastrous diet, meat, dairy, and chemical foods all ferment into a soup of killer microbes that destroy immune and brain function.
Now, how many of you, let's be honest, feel like you have a soup after you've been eating all that nasty stuff inside?
You feel acidic, don't you? And you know what happened is that meat got cheap. Well, we know why meat got cheap, because the government supports the meat industry and the dairy industry. So meat got cheap, and we started to eat much more of it, and we kind of skipped the vegetables and the fruits and the good stuff. And now our bodies turn more and more acidic.
Yeah, when you look back at my grandparents' generation, and certainly their generation before, their parents, meat consumption was very, very, very minor. Matter of fact, when I, 50 years ago, chose to become a vegan, the only advocate I had was my grandmother. My grandmother pulled me aside after my mom and dad had heart attacks. They walked out mumbling, "He's now really cracked up." And grandmom came over, little Irish Gertie Daly, and said, "You're going to be okay. I guess I was a vegan too." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You know, when I was young, the only time we ate meat is to show off to the neighbors or relatives when they came, which wasn't very often." And when she first said that to me, she was such a loving grandmother, I actually thought she was being supportive, but exaggerating. Over time, I realized that that was actually true. That today, every meal has meat in it. The average meal in 1950, one meal a day had meat in it. When I was a kid growing up, some of the desserts and in-between meals I had were beef jerkies. Can you imagine? And so this is where this soup comes from.
Yeah, and the same with salt and sugar and fat, and you know, it was a very minor part of our diet in the past, and now it's huge. That's huge.
Yeah, now where do you think salt and sugar came into the picture? Anyone have any idea? How many of you remember that we didn't have refrigeration a while ago? And when people started to eat meat in small amounts, the only way they could keep it so the bugs didn't eat it and decay it was put what on it? Salt. We should have known better. If we could actually put salt on something and prevent it from rotting, and then we start to eat it, so that's where we got the taste. Sugar. When I was growing up, you know, people literally had gardens in their backyard. How many of you are old enough to remember that? Yeah. And at the end of the season, when the freeze was about to come, they would actually take all of that and they would put it in a jar with what? Sugar. Because sugar, like salt, are so absolutely noxious to life as we know it, it literally prevents decay and breakdown of that food. So that's where we got the taste for salt and sugar.
And when we get off it, we kind of have withdrawal. Some of you that are here, you're probably going through withdrawal right now because it's a drought. So the growing family of maladies, bloating, heartburn, constipation, diarrhea, irritable bowel syndrome, diverticulosis, etc., are symptoms of an unhealthy environment in the digestive and elimination canal.
Now, how many of you were told you have one of these problems up there? Raise your hand. Now, let's go through each of these a little bit. And we'll start with bloating. I don't know anyone here, including Anna Marie and I, who haven't had bloating. But bloating is actually a symptom of undigested, fermenting food that's often created from mixing the wrong foods together. That's food combined.
Then we go to, I'll go to diverticulitis, because that is inflammation of diverticulitis. It's polyps that we have there. And what happens to this? That's where the soup can lodge itself. That's where the soup can really stay and cause big trouble. Because, you know, you have 100 trillion microbes in your intestines. 100 trillion. And most of them are good, but in this pockets that we makes when inflammation and polyps grow. That's when bad bacteria can, and now we can go into more serious problems and even colon cancer. So how do we get rid of polyps? Why did they even come there to begin with? Why do we have this inflammation?
How many of you remember when you had a pimple as a child on your face?
Yeah.
That's literally the same thing. So it's little pockets of infection that invert. They go backward. So diverticulosis goes one way, diverticulitis goes the other way. And as Anna Maria said, these pockets of infections create inflammation, and everyone that gets Crohn's or colitis first had diverticulosis or diverticulitis. Isn't that interesting? That's the progression of the disease.
And gastric cancer.
And then we look at this big, ominous category now we have, irritable bowel syndrome. You know what that is? They don't know what it is. So everything that they don't know what it is, they put into that category. Now, sadly, it's something, but it's a wide variety of disorders. And it's pretty much the pipes and the toilet get backed up, and the body is no longer functioning the way that it should to digest food, break it down, let the nutrients go into the cell, the fiber come out the back, and the water come out the front. At this point, what's happening is the water's not coming out the way it should, the fiber's not coming out the way it should, and the anatomy of the body literally starts to become distended, abnormal, and infected. That's what irritable bowel syndrome is. By the way, every one of these disorders we put here are correctable. And sadly, mainstream doctors would tell people what?
Oh, that is not correctable. That we need medications and we need maybe surgeries. You know.
You need surgery. And by the way, if you happen to have colitis or Crohn's disease, it's 100%. Your whole life you're going to have that. And your lifespan shortened. And literally you're on medicines every single day your whole life. And I've never worked with somebody that had the courage and the perseverance who could not correct that disorder. One after another.
Heartburn.
How about heartburn?
Reflux. Acid reflux. So many people are on medication for this. And the purple pill, or God knows what they're called. And that is very dangerous in the long run. Because your body is now giving you signals that we have chaos. And you better deal with it. And a pill will never, ever deal with it. So that is fool's game. And we really need to understand that when your body gives you these symptoms, you have to change. You have to do a 360. And that's what we see here. Heartburn usually goes away in 3 weeks here if I'm eating this food. Now, look what we have. There's something called soluble and insoluble fiber. So what is soluble? That is foods that you digest. It's like avocados and peas and beans and grains. And then what is insoluble? That's the stuff, that's the fiber that's going to move things out of you. But most of it is not, you can't digest it. But it's so important. By the time it gets into the large intestine, it will move. Because it's the stalks, it's the peels, it's all of that. So if I don't eat enough stalks, like here we eat stalks all day long. And we eat peels all day long, and we get all that fiber, and it works its way, and it's so important to keep your intestines clean, and that brings acidity out. That's a big part of that heartburn that you feel. That has nothing to do with the heartbeat. It's all the gut.
How many of you have ever gone to a health store and purchased a bottle of prebiotics? Guess what? You're getting prebiotics in this cellulose that Anna Maria just spoke about. What a prebiotic is cellulose from plants. You don't have to buy it and put it in a container. Go out and buy a stalk of celery and eat it. That's about what you need.
Yeah. Here comes your gut being the epicenter of bacterial royalty leads to the manufacture of serotonin, which calms minds and prevents this depression. This process occurs when there is a lack coming from the bioterrain, so that the endorphin activity, dopamine production, and neuroreceptor site activity is harmed.
Now, just today, I was on the phone with a young woman, 40 years old, who said, my whole life as a child I had depression. And about 10 years ago, I got on a raw food diet, and magically, after being the psychiatrist and psychologist, my depression was gone within a matter of 4 months. And she said, nobody ever told me, even after I got well, that it was because I had no healthy bacteria in my intestinal tract. So let's go through this and break it down, because this is how important this subject is. So we go first to the bacterial royalty that creates serotonin. If you go to universities today, if you went to McGill, or you went to Oxford, or you went to Stanford, they would be teaching the psychiatrist the wrong thing. Isn't that sad? They would actually, at Stanford University, be teaching doctoral students in psychiatric medicine that, by the way, serotonin is created in the brain. Wrong. 80% of the serotonin is created in the intestinal tract. But for it to be created, and for it to be functional, and for it to work, you have to have a healthy bacteria count in the intestinal tract.
It's mainly soil-based bacteria, and the main one that makes serotonin is in soil. And it's called mycotoxin vaccae. I don't know exactly how to say it, but it's a funny name, mycotoxin vaccae. And that produces serotonin, big time. Of course, a lot of other microbes do too, but that's the main one. So what if the soil is now destroyed with pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides, and all of that? You think we're getting that toxin? No.
Exactly.
It's actually a fungus.
Even if you're getting soil and eating food that's grown in rich soil, if in fact they put these chemicals on it, what you're actually doing is destroying in the soil as well as your intestinal tract. Now here, let's go to the next step. Now we talk about endorphins. How many of you remember the wonderful book back in the 70s called The Zen of Running? And it was the Zen of bicycling, and the Zen of this. Well, what the Zen is, when you, how many of you are exercisers here? Raise your hand. You get into that zone, it's endorphins that put you into that zone. But if you don't have serotonin coming from the intestinal tract because of the bacteria that Anna Maria spoke about from the soil, you cannot create endorphins. Dopamine. How many of you know what the disease Parkinson's is? It's a dopamine deficiency. I'm not suggesting the only reason we get Parkinson's disease is bad bacteria, but it's a contributory reason, in some cases, the majority reason you get Parkinsonian disease.
So gut and brain are connected. They call it the gut-brain axis. And how that's happening is connected to something called the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is the longest nerve you have in your body, and it is connected the gut to the brain.
Isn't that amazing? You have a big nerve. So somebody says, you hit my nerve. Think about that nerve. That's probably the nerve they hit.
Yeah.
Now, neuroreceptors, you know what they are? Hormones. When you're sitting there listening to us and making sense out of what we say, it's neuroreceptors that are communicating back and forth to one another that let the neurons in the brain say, oh, that sound makes a word, and that word brings a memory, and these words together bring a sentence, and I remember, and I see, and I visualize. It's amazing. But without healthy bacteria, guess what? The brain doesn't function as well as it should. So am I saying you only get mental illness if you have a bad intestine? You get lower intellect when you have a bad intestine. Now, I don't have to be told that, because my whole youth, I had upset stomachs because I never ate food. Mixed everything that you shouldn't mix together. And so I would be sort of in a stupor most of the time, half awake, because of the intestinal soup that we spoke about earlier.
So 70% of our immune system resides in the gut, and 90% of serotonin, the happy hormone, is produced in the gut. So that is the top line from second brain, which is called to first brain. So it actually has, through the vagus nerve, it has a direct line. It's like picking up the phone and giving messages. And later on we see a doctor from, Dr. Proctor. He had, he's really found through all his research that we're saying that the depression and the anxiety gave us IBS or bad stomach or constipation, but he says it's the opposite actually, it's the opposite. It's our gut problem that gave us anxiety and depression. So imagine that, the other way around.
It's so surprising that only recently in science and biology we're looking at the gut-brain connection. Because I remember as a student, I always thought I didn't have to study for a test. How many of you were in that category? Somehow I had a much bigger ego than a brain. They said, I don't have to study. But what would happen when I sat to do that test, and in front of me was the test questions to my stomach? How many of you remember that? How many remember feeling nauseous and shaking? That was the second brain. So it's really stunning. That's been going on from the beginning of humanity, I'm sure. And as Anna Maria pointed out, and we're going to elaborate on this as time goes on tonight, is literally, it makes sense to a psychiatrist formally trained. It's the brain creating the intestinal problem, but it sort of reminds me of what we thought, and I thought, frankly, incorrectly, until 1996. Until 1996, if you said, how do people get ulcers, I would have told you the standard answer. You get ulcers because you're stressed. 1996 what happened? Nobel Prize was given to two guys that said, no, it's not stress, it's something called H. pylori. Isn't that interesting? So there's one thing blowing out of the water. It now took us another 20 years to say, wow, you have the second brain that may be more important than the upper brain, and I'm going to tell you it's absolutely more important, because when I use these terms, you'll know why I mean this. Gut instinct. You don't have a brain instinct, you have a what? Gut instinct.
All bacteria originates in beneficial, balanced, nourishing soil. For this reason, all effective supplementation must be derived from the strains that make up rich soil.
Now this one we want you to really understand. So at the end of the night, if you didn't understand it, we'll have a question and answer period. It's not just enough to take nutrients. You have to have nutrients that were grown in rich soil because not only will they have more vitamins and more minerals, but the bacteria does something extraordinary to that nutrient. Do you follow? So when we, for instance, produce the Life Give supplements, we go way, 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 way to the extreme to know and to test and have tested the soils that these plants are grown in before we actually grind them up and put them into a supplement. Now, there is something that we cannot even yet describe. There's a symbiosis. You all know what that means. Working together. A symbiosis that happens when you have bacterial-rich nutrient plants. That does not happen. Does not happen. The bacteria doesn't grow when you don't have. So you could have organic plants, as Stanford University showed us 5 years ago, and all my colleagues yelled at me because I agreed with Stanford when they said something that was studied, and they said, commercial organic food grown on millions of acres in California is no more nutritious than normal food. Agreed, because if you put organic food on bad soil, you get the bad result. Now, I would always buy, and I'm sure several times a year I eat that organic food grown on the soil. That's not so good, because at least you don't get pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and genetic. But can you sustain life on that? Not really. And it's because what's lacking? Not the nutrients so much as the bacteria that's in it.
Yeah, and it's very, you heard about fungi, how important fungi is for the forest and for the symbiosis with the roots of the trees and every plant, and to give nourishment to the plant. So of course, the richer the soil is, the better our food is going to be. Because we need, what the plant needs, we need. But we all get it from the soil. It actually started, and Wigmore, who founded this institute, what did she say?
She said, everything's in the soil. I'll never forget one time I was frustrated, and she was so simple and so pure. I kept asking these elaborate questions because I was insecure. And she said, don't you get it? If it's in the soil, it's in the plant, and you eat it, it's in you.
Yeah.
That was the best science ever heard on the subject, actually.
You know, and kids, normally kids are allowed to sit and pick things, and they pick things up, and when they're outside they eat soil. This is really actually good for them because they're meant to get all these kind of different bacteria to build their immune system, and they have their immune system like white blood cells that are just waiting, and what some doctor explained is like, if they're just waiting and they have nothing to do, sooner or later they're going to attack something and do bad things because they're meant to actually attack. So our kids, for example, are brought up here. I mean, God knows they've been eating all kinds of things and vegetables from the garden and just picking up things from the garden and eating it. These soil bacteria is meant to come into us. And now we wash everything, and we wash their hands, and every school, every nursery have all kinds of hand washes, and you wash, and you wash off all the good bacteria that you really need to build up their immune system.
Do you know how sick the people are in Japan because everything is over-sterile there?
Yeah.
They have disorders in Japan that no other society on the planet Earth have because they are so sterile and so clean. And we know for sure these hand sanitizers like Prel actually mutate animals in the environment because the deadly chemicals they make this out of. Now, by the way, you can use hand sanitizers. They're natural forms. You can buy at good health stores and on the internet. How many of you remember yourself or somebody you know eating soil when they were children?
Yeah.
My parents used to have to get me out of the garden because I ate soil. You know what that's a sign of? Not you're a stupid child, you're a smart child.
Yeah.
You're literally trying to attain the bacteria that you're not getting in the food.
Prebiotics are actually cellulose from plants, which is the natural food for healthy gut bacteria. This intricate system of positive microbes require constant feeding from raw, organic, plant-based fare.
Now, can you imagine we don't give ourselves raw, organic, plant-based fare? I never did that in my first 20 years of life. Never would I think to eat that. Never did I think that was food. As a matter of fact, when I would look at these type of foods, I would get nauseous. I would gag. How many of you relate to that? I'd look at a salad. Every once in a while, my family would bring us to a fancy hamburger place, and they'd put a sprig of parsley on the side. And I remember I couldn't even eat the hamburger because the parsley grows to the outside. Now I take 2 pounds of it and juice it and drink it. It's weird. Now, what happens on the inverse? What happens when we put muscle from an animal? That's called meat, by the way. The muscle from an animal into the body. And we put the milk from another species into the body. And we go back to that concept that we gave you, the big soup that's in it. Well, we know for sure that meat and dairy does not digest in anyone's body ever. You say, well, how did that happen? I thought it was digesting. No. It takes 3 days to pass through the body. Notice I didn't say digest. Pass through the body. It leaves behind 3 notable acids that erode tissue, kill cells. It literally takes the majority of the immune system function to literally get rid of that out of the body and make it antiseptic. And don't think dairy is any better than meat, because it has the very, very similar, unfortunate, bad qualities that meat have. And meat is not red meat. Get over that stuff. Meat is fish. Meat is chicken. Meat is turkey. Meat is duck. Meat is red meat. All of this is meat. Dairy is Greek yogurt. Dairy is cheese. I don't care if this is organic or not. Dairy is kefir. Dairy is my old favorite, whipped cream and ice cream and butter. Too bad we didn't have a dish back in those days where we put butter on ice cream and put whipped cream on the top. I would have loved that. So we're destroying our intestinal tract. We are destroying our immune system. We are creating acidity that erodes our immune system in literal flesh, rather than constantly supplying the body with raw, living, organic roughage that you require to have healthy bacteria and immunity. This is not a theory we're talking about tonight, people. This is the best science that you'll ever hear on the subject, what I just talked about, of prebiotic and probiotic. It's that clear, that simple, and not debatable. It's only debatable by people who are not knowledgeable on the subject. That's all I can say.
We just talked to somebody and told them that we're vegan. Oh yeah, and it kind of picture it's all cooked vegan. And then we said, no, it's raw. It's all raw. And it got all quiet. I got like,
first thing you said, you better wash the stuff.
Yeah, you better wash it. And we're like, no, we don't wash it. Yeah, but we wash too much and we're too careful. And that's where the sprouts come in. Because you can grow them at home, you can grow them in soil, and you can actually get your own bacteria right from the soil that you're growing too.
You know, the truth of the matter is, and I don't do this, I'm just going to tell you the truth of the matter. When I lived in Switzerland and I brought the program there about 40 years ago, there was a movement out of France called the Instinctualists at that point, that were major advocates of raw food and had great research and science behind it. They wouldn't even let you wash the vegetables when you brought them in from the garden. Now, was that right? Absolutely. Because you're going to get more bacteria on that than when we put them under our chlorine-rich water at our sink.
Yeah.
Now, I don't do that. I'm just telling you it made sense.
Colostrum from your mother's breast milk, which you suckle the first minute after birth, provides a lifetime worth of balanced, beautiful, and effective bacteria. This gift from mother and nature is the foundation for physical and emotional health.
Isn't that amazing? Before we used to segregate this. You know, MDs don't think psychiatrists are MDs. MDs and psychiatrists don't think dentists are MDs. They're all MDs. They just have specialties in it. And they're all, if well-educated and open-minded, probably great at the field that they're working in. But we are now able to say to you, your emotional health not only depends upon you suckling from your mother's breast. And when Anna Marie and I talk to young mothers and we go out and we speak about family and raising children, we say the biggest part of giving breastfeeding to your babies and children is that emotional connection. But now there's an added attraction to that. It's the chemical process that gives you lifelong, 120 years if you live that long.
You know.
Stability emotionally.
Yeah, within 20 minutes, you have the same microbiota as your mother. You get all that from your mother. And you get it from the vaginal canal, you get it from the breast, you get it from her skin. And you build all that up. In 20 minutes, you have everything you need for the rest of your life.
Now let's dissect what Anna Maria just said. If you had a vaginal birth, how many of you here were cesarean or gave birth cesarean? So there's my problem and your problem. I was a cesarean child. Then the second thing is, how many of us were not breastfed here? Raise your hand. So now it's always 60, 70% of us. And when I asked my educated mother, Mom, why in the middle of the 20th century did you not breastfeed me? She actually seriously said to me, the doctors told us it was not as good as formula. That was my mother, so I didn't make fun of her. But the reality was, that's how we are trained to be subservient to professionals who are supposed to know more. Now, men, all the men here are going to understand what I say and agree with it. We love breasts, but breasts aren't there for men to look at. Even though we love them. What are breasts there for? So somewhere along the line, somebody's going to say, well, especially poor women. Poor women have these things floating around all the time when you run and all this stuff. Nature didn't put them there just for guys to look at. You're supposed to be breastfeeding on this one. And you know, in our house, it's really funny because our last child was breastfed for 3 years, and we were talking to a very close friend of ours, one of the board members here at Hippocrates, and she said, I didn't tell anyone, but I breastfed for 5 years. And she showed us an article about a tribe that commonly does that to 5 or 6. I said, as long as you don't go to the teens, that's okay.
Antibiotics, alcohol, and other noxious chemistry disturbs and destroys floral fauna, which often takes up to 6 months to recover. This plays a central role in nurturing immune system function and sparks havoc in neuronal normality, leading to psychological concern.
So let's imagine that you had a vaginal birth, your mother was a plant-based eater, you have a great emotional, surrounding and family atmosphere, you love your work, everything is going right, but somehow you think drinking organic wine is perfectly fine. You see what I'm saying? We now have just yesterday read 3 studies we didn't know yesterday morning. You know that. And all 3 of these studies now, finally, we've waited decades, told us how incredibly toxic all forms of alcohol are.
It came out on Sunday morning at 3 a.m. I happened to look at the news, and then it came out and it said absolutely, research, I think it's Italian doctors now, absolutely no alcohol, no alcohol. And by 7 in the morning it was gone. The news were gone.
Isn't that interesting?
Pay for that.
So it was on international press,
Yeah.
and you know the trolls that all the major industries have immediately got that off.
Yep.
So then what we saw as a backlash, there were 2 other studies, definitive studies from major universities. So now the trend is moving that way. And why? No other reason. I'll give you 20 other reasons, but no other reason, because it takes 6 months. 1 glass of organic wine. It takes 6 months to recover the immune system from that.
Recover the microbiota. So also, like let's say we take a heavy-duty antibiotic like Cipro, they found that can take up to 4 years to re-establish our microbiota. Yeah, so we gotta talk to the doctor if we do need antibiotic, if we do have a bacterial infection. You know, it doesn't work. None of the antibiotic works on virus. Virus, it's given for viral infections, which is crazy because it never worked on that. But you need to talk, and I would highly suggest never to take Cipro. It is an enormous toxic agent for your whole microbiota. It kills so much, and you pay for it for a long, long time.
I was stunned when I lived abroad to find out that many of the commonly used medicines by dermatologists and MDs for pimples and acne, in Europe, if you prescribe them more than 6 months, you can lose your medical license.
Right.
Here we put people on it for 20 years.
Yeah.
routine.
Yeah, can you imagine this?
Yeah, you got it.
So we're gonna now listen to this. I hope this is all plugged in and ready to go. All right. This is a great description of how everything works, and we can elaborate on it in just a minute.
Digestion is the process of breaking food down so that nutrients can be absorbed by cells. In your stomach, food is churned and mixed with acid and enzymes. It is then pushed into the first part of the small intestine, where most digestion and absorption takes place. To aid absorption, it is mixed with bile, which is produced by the liver and discharged from the gallbladder through ducts. Digested food molecules pass into blood vessels in the walls of the intestine and are carried up through the portal vein into the liver for further processing and storage. The liver is usually a rich red color, but excess lipids stored in its cells can change it to a whitish color. This is known as fatty liver disease. It is closely associated with obesity, particularly central obesity, involving the omentum, a fatty pad that hangs down from the stomach. Eating too much fat can cause it to push out, producing a large waistline. In some people, eating certain foods can irritate the walls of the small intestine and disrupt regular movement, resulting in altered bowel habits or irritable bowel. Almost all nutrients have been absorbed by the time digested food leaves the small intestine and enters the colon, where water and salt are extracted, leaving solid wastes for elimination.
So that's a very clear description. Do you all follow what they said? And if we at all impair or block this system at any point by eating non-foods, by eating chemicals, by eating too fast, by eating too much, by eating under stress, this is a very volatile system. It's an incredibly important central system to your overall well-being. But you cannot rush to eat, and I teach this and I still do it sometimes. You cannot be angry when you eat. You cannot be in conversation, but you need to chew and be focused on what you're doing, because if not, you can impair it. Now, how many of you realize that now it's estimated in the United States and most of Europe that over half the population has some level of fatty liver disease? And we know this very well because my baby brother at 50 years old died from fatty liver disease. So I had to speak at his funeral and put him in the grave when his 2 children and his wife were crying there. Because his favorite sport was eating. And I can relate to that because at one point my favorite sport was eating. And he'd always say, I love food. And I say, well, we notice that. You weigh about 100 pounds more than you should. Now, it's great to say all of these things, but the reality is the end result, as you see, can be death on this. And if you don't die, it's almost better in some ways, but other ways not as good. Because you're sitting around half functioning most of your life. It's really an odd situation.
Yeah, and we see the Institute gets people from all over the world with all kinds of problems, and we're getting much younger and younger people in late teens. Like, let's say, in the 10, 15 years ago, if kids came here with Crohn's and colitis, they would be like 18, 19 years old. Guess how old they are now? They're 10. So we moved down about 10 years in the last 10, 15 years. And so that is, if that's not telling us that we're on the wrong track and we're eating heavy-duty processed food, doesn't have any microbes, cannot give us the bacteria that we need. So God forbid we weren't nursed and we were not brought up on good diet from the beginning, and then we get to school. What does the school feed you? It's the worst. You can't. What does a hospital feed you? That was really a joke. Yes. So
I think they actually pay them to feed you that food.
It makes you wonder.
Stay sick.
Yeah.
Well, I'll never forget, Anna-Marie and I were lecturing 15 years ago in Oslo on a very beautiful day in August, where it was so nice we actually spoke outside to 200 people. And at the end of the talk, our good friend and colleague came up with a McDonald's hamburger. And he had a great sense of humor.
No, listen.
But he was one of us, so I thought, what the heck is he going to say about this? And he actually said to the audience, how old do you think this is? And they all looked at it, 3 or 4 observed it, and they said, you got that today? He said, no, I got that when I graduated medical school 10 years ago. And they said, no, it looks exactly what you buy today. He said, you know why I knew how to do this? He said, 2 days before I graduated from medical school, our professor showed us a 25-year-old McDonald's hamburger. And it looked exactly like this. Now think of what I just said. This is what we're putting into our food and purporting that it's food. Thinking it's nutrition. It is an inanimate object. It's literally an inanimate object. It has nothing to do with food.
No. So meat, dairy, food additives, chemicals, excess cooked food consumption, and hostile beverages all play central roles in wiping out healthy pre- and probiotics. Studies have shown that colon cancer, Crohn's, colitis, and even mental illness increases when people choose to consume these non-nutritional poisonous choices.
How many of you know that the differences, quantitative differences in countries that are plant-based eating with emotional disorders and here? They're minuscule amounts. They're not mental institutions filled with people. There's not people being shot every other day in schools. That there is a wildly different, where the inverse happens to in countries where they consume actually more meat and animal foods than we do. If you go to the countries that consume the most rape, the most murder, the most violence happen in these countries. And why? Now we understand that there's a direct, scientifically validated reason, and that's the gastrointestinal tract. We used to just think it made people aggressive. Well, it makes people feel abnormal because they don't have biochemistry functioning so that their body and brain and immunity work in symbiosis together. Pretty interesting. You notice we said too much cooked food. Because even if you took all of this food we give you, this organic, wonderful food, raw food, and we cooked it constantly, what happens to that food? And it turns into what? The big S word. Sugar. So all you're getting out of it is sugar. And what did we start with? We started to say, how did we get into eating salt and sugar? We used to preserve, quote, food from that. Well, sugar is the greatest of all alterers to the human brain.
And with this follows cancer, arthritis, autism, Alzheimer, you name it. It's just going to follow heart disease, of course, big time, and obesity, big time. So, if we can eliminate this and we can add fresh vegetables, fresh fruits, seeds, nuts, grains, and eat things that are organic, of course, it's the biggest thing. You don't want to, I say, if you pick a plate here and then just before you eat it, I say, no, I need to spray some Roundup on it. You would not be so pleased. But that's what's happening.
Yeah, people don't think about that. I mean, to give an example, as good as broccoli is for you, realize that broccoli, if it's not organic, is one of the most heavily sprayed crops on the planet Earth. Apples, incredibly good for you. One of the heaviest sprayed.
And grapes.
Grapes. 1968, I was marching with Ted Kennedy against Allard. How many of you remember when they put Allard on the market? Allard was, of course, they grow apples in northern regions. They would actually spray it on the apple tree so that they would prematurely ripen, synthetically ripen. So they'd never freeze. And thank God, 60 Minutes actually did an expose on them and showed what Allard did. And one fell swoop, by the way, wiped the Allard industry out. But back then we were marching because they sprayed trees at that point 8 times a year. You know what it is now? 17 to 19 times a year, depending upon where you are.
Yeah. Microbiome balance. Within the intestine, we can now determine the metabolic fitness and inflammatory activity. Johns Hopkins J. Pastisha, MD, then said the enteric nervous system, ENS, doesn't seem capable of thought as we know it, but it communicates back and forth with our big brain. And he's the one that I talked about before. He said, it may be we're thinking wrong, that we got IBS and constipation and bad stomach from our anxiety and depression. He thinks it's the other way around.
Now, many of you have heard these terms, but maybe you've never seen it laid out as simply as this artist has done for us. Look at the two nervous systems. Do you see that up there? And notice that every one of those nerves reach a different organ in the body. Now, why would it not make complete sense that lack of nourishment would impair all the organs of the body, and communication with the organs, and adequate amounts, even more than necessary nutrition, would actually allow them to communicate better and function better. So it's quite simple. It's no longer, oh, we eat bad food and it affects the heart or the liver. It affects the entire bodily system. If you're affecting the heart, it's affecting the liver. If you're affecting the brain, it's affecting the toe. And why? Because the nervous system is what ties this whole anatomy together.
And it starts all the way from swallowing the food to all the way to the coming out. That's following the whole thing, enteric nervous system. The gastrointestinal microbiome consists of 100 trillion bacteria that are housed in the large intestine.
Isn't that amazing? Think of it. That's actually what they look like. So if I take a camera and place it where the enema tube will be tonight, this is what we'd see. So why do you think we, by the way, tell you in the initial stages of cleansing the body, it's a brilliant thing to use water flushes internally, but always follow them up with what? Wheatgrass implants. So one of the things I agree with mainstream gastrointestinal specialists, if you just do colonics and if you just do enemas, and you don't follow it up by putting nutrients in, you'll have a bowel imbalance. You'll wipe out the healthy bacteria. Now, not as effectively as you will with an antibiotic or you will with alcohol, but pretty effectively. So we see it here because we've been doing it for all these decades. When people come in, we do blood tests. When people leave, we do blood tests. And we watch the electrolytes. The electrolytes are the minerals in the intestinal tract. And we can always tell when people have been cheating here. As we tell every guest, after you do your enema, after you do your colonics here, go and do a wheatgrass implant, put it in, let it remineralize, let it rebacterialize the gastrointestinal tract. If you don't do it, we can actually see it because your electrolytes are not what they should be.
You know, microbiome, that was just got the name 2001. It was called gut flora. Everybody called it the gut flora. So this is the gut flora. Now it's called microbiome. And, you know, mainly it's bacteria. It's more than 90% bacteria. There's some viral and there's some other cells with nuclei in there. And, you know, of course, we haven't talked about parasites, but parasites are very much a part of what's happening in every country in the world. We think because we go to some other country and we get parasitic infection and we get diarrhea, that it doesn't happen here. It happens here all the time. But we don't always get diarrhea. We get it mainly from water sources. Like we do a fecal test here at the Institute for the ones who needs it. And it's amazing how many pathogens are in our fecal matter. And what you have in your mouth and you have in your fecal matter are pretty much the same, you know. And there is a funny thing, 99.9% of us are all the same. Our genome is exactly the same. We have brown eyes, blue eyes, whatever, but we are 99.9. When it comes to the microbiome, we are 80 to 90% different. So it depends on what we've been eating and what we've drank and what we've been around. Like couples, we have more than 90% the same microbiome. That's what happens in a family.
You know, it's interesting. You may have never met, you fall in love a month later, now you've just woven together and have the same bacteria as bacillus. Isn't that amazing? And today we spoke about in class, so we'll, for the benefit of the people who came in tonight, talk about 2 landmark studies. The first one, talk about what they discovered with sperm.
Oh, you talk about it.
Okay. She wants me to take the sperm part. They found that sperm at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, one of the most reputable and notable medical schools on earth, they've been watching for decades now. Certain unique cells surround sperm as it's coming down the canal to fertilize the egg. And they could not quite grasp what was happening. They finally, in 2016, captured this and published research on it. What's happening is a communication, an intelligent, highly intelligent communication is happening, so that the father's lifestyle is being implanted in the sperm, so that, in fact, when you're born, if your father was a junk food eater, you're born with a disadvantage. If your father's negative, you're born with a disadvantage. On the other hand, imagine your father is healthy and happy and well-adjusted. You're born with that advantage. And we used to think it was purely biology. Now we realize it's quantum energy that's happening. So this is where we're all heading at this point. And the next one on women, that was really interesting, about women who made love with men.
Oh, yeah. That it's DNA from the bacteria of the man actually is in our brain. So however many men we have and however many different bacteria, it's actually lodged in our brain.
So if you made love with a man when you were 18 years old and now you're 68 years old, part of him is in your brain.
Yes.
How do you get him out?
Yeah, we just figured out it's there. We don't have that answer yet.
We already know it got in there.
So, and I don't want to make anyone sound risque, but if you've had romance or intimacy with 10 men, at this point, we don't think it will ever leave. And up until now, wrong assumption, good assumption, but wrong assumption, we thought the DNA we were discovering in the brain, exceptional to you, was from your mother and father. So what this means is what we've suspected in quantum biology. Now I'll be writing about this and studying it more, because we thought that when you interact with other environments, other people, that it permanently alters your sense of awareness. Now we're having biological proof that that's true. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So any of you that have the James Dean love of men, stay away from those guys. You want the Mozart love of men, the Einstein love of men. Maybe they're not as sexy, but the reality is it's better to have them in your brain.
So, you know, our microbiome is totally dependent on environmental influences. So if I'm not taking a lot of alcohol and I'm taking tons of antibiotic for some reason, that's changing it. So it evolves. And if you're starting on a diet like this now, you're changing your microbiome to the good.
To the better.
To the better. The bodily protector of the GI barrier is called. The bodily protector of the microbial functional entity consistent of epithelial defense and metabolic functions, the mucosal immune system, and the enteric ENS nervous system.
Now, isn't that interesting? We were so fortunate to find this piece of art, because it literally shows you what we're saying. This is all a lot of big words, so let's explain it to you in a way that everyone will understand. So if you look at here, the parameter, you see this open area. The parameter is actually the mucoid membrane around there. That's a defense. It actually defends between the biochemistry, good, bad, or indifferent, that comes into the body, and what's happening in the intestinal tract. And you see there's intricacies between pathways. And we used to think this was for blood circulation, but now we know it's to carry bacteria, maybe more importantly than blood circulation. Isn't that interesting? So it's an interaction between bacteria and bacteria, and this wonderful process creates strong head and strong immunity.
Yeah, and you know, another thing about soil plant-based bacteria, they actually have a shell that they, we're always worried that we get enough probiotic, doesn't get killed by the acidity. Well, when it comes to these guys, the microbes, they go right through, and by the time they get into the intestine, that's when they start working, and they actually germinate in there.
Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
So you have little sprouts of bacteria
Yes.
happening in your body. So you have a tickly stomach, you know what it is.
Yeah. Oh.
This is we try to get the most neutral picture on poop we could. But this is a poop talk, like it or not.
So imagine living in a world where illness is optional. Biome is the first genetic test that determines your RNA and DNA well-being, which relates with the foods you should avoid or consume. Studying fecal bacteria, as MIT is, brings us a new and viable tool to correct and prevent many disorders which begin in the gut.
So this wonderful, wonderful doctor who was way ahead, he's still way ahead of his time, who created a wonderful organization called Genomics. Does anyone know that organization? They were the first people that stepped out of the box a generation or two ago and said, let's really do incredibly sophisticated testing on the overall body. Well, he called me up all excited like a kid 3-4 months ago and said, the latest of the greatest thing that we're now doing is we've been working with top scientists, physicists, and biologists, and now we can, from the fecal matter, determine more than any other aspect of testing we've done in the past. The highest level of testing, this is the next level of it. And so we got kits sent. Dr. Bob got kits sent, we got kits sent, and by the way, this is amazing stuff. So it shows what you've done to corrupt your body, and because often we've corrupted our bodies, certain foods that are even good for us may not be presently the right food for you to eat. Isn't that interesting? So even though, yes, it's good, and most of us it would work for, because you've done such a disturbing amount of disorderly things in your lifestyle, that at this point right now, let's avoid that. Why? To get once again into the balance, the bacteria count, which is represented in the fecal matter. So DNA and RNA testing from fecal matter is one of the promising parts of the future of medicine.
Yeah, actually, if you do that test, it's a fecal test, and you go through a lot of questions, emotional, physical questions, and it actually, the system will unlock the information and give you nutritional advice. So it's really great. Now,
Well, let's say this. We're waiting for them to go one more step before we're satisfied, and that will be offered to our guest here very soon, once we get our heads around it.
So fecal implant, how many heard about fecal implants? They're using it for a lot. Of course, for Crohn's and colitis, they've been using it for years, because a lot of these kids don't have any, the microbes are so poor that they can't digest anything. Everything goes right through them. And they've been doing fecal implants, but now they're using it for neurological disorders, they're using it for depression, they're using it for some forms of cancer. So this is going big. So why do we have to go to that extreme? I mean, that is kind of extreme, because what we could have done, we could have got these bacteria from soil and implanted.
One of the great stories, our children always thought they had very weird parents, you can imagine. So I'll repeat a story. Anna Marie and I are driving to the west coast of Florida to speak, and our son is maybe 10 or 12 years old at the time, and halfway across the state, Anna Marie and I said, we want you to donate your poop to a patient we're working with. So absolutely nothing was said for about a minute. And that's the first time I understood he knew curse words. You're the strangest people in the world. Why the hell would you ask me to donate? So I didn't say anything for a few minutes, and then Anna Marie and I said, do you remember that boy that came here who corrected colitis? And he came to the program, as we've seen hundreds and hundreds of times, people correct colitis and Crohn's disease eating this way. I said, but what happened, he got bullied at school and now he has it again, and the doctors think he's so sick he may die. He's bleeding anally, etc. So he finally broke down and said, okay, we'll donate. We had to make a deal. We overfed him.
Yes.
so he got extra sprouts for a while. So he was so proud, and one weekend we overfed him and he pooped in a container. They came down and
No,
collected.
28 containers.
No. They
That we
came
have to
down and
fix.
collected the container
Oh,
on Monday.
With 28.
And then that night, on Monday, they called back and said to Antony and I, we need 27 more containers.
Then in 4 days.
In
So
4
we had
days.
to-
Boy, we had to super feed them at that point. You know what they do to those poor animals? So this is, as Anna Maria has pointed out, incredibly important research. And go back to what we said. They're using it for cancer. They're using it for mental illness. They're using it for Crohn's, colitis, diverticulosis, diverticulitis. Why? Because once you get healthy bacteria in the body, the immune system works. So of course, it helps to correct every single disease known to man. And as I pointed out in class today, MIT is leading the world in studying this at this point. So sadly, it was really on a roll. Now the pharmaceuticals are trying to slow it down. They're saying the only time we can use it with research protocol. So some poor individuals that are half dead have to find some research protocol to do it. And this is the nonsense you deal with.
Now, all of these people here that made this elimination needs fiber, right? Loads of fiber. And you know what
This
they-
one's a rabbit over here.
Yeah, that's it.
You know what that's indicative of, by the way? Gallbladder problem.
Yeah, that's fiber problem.
A rabbit would have that normally, but you shouldn't have it. That would be gallbladder.
So when they test centenarians, why they're so healthy, big part is they eat much more fiber than the rest. Much more fiber. And if you have no fiber, if everything you eat is cooked and the fiber is not the same, you will be malnourished because you can't absorb it well. You're not taking the nourishment in. When emotionally secure and not dealing with eating disorder, fast on raw green juices, a minimum of 1 day a week, no fruits or sugary vegetables like carrots and beets, sugary rice. Sugar precipitates abnormal negative bacterial growth.
So the best and fastest and most effective way to make bad bacteria grow is feed it sugar. Every single form of sugar. Now, what a lot of us do is we become closet sugar eaters. We give up the obvious sugar. We give up white sugar, we give up honey, we give up maple syrup, we give up date sugar, we give up xylitol, all the sugars that are sugar. And then we eat a half a loaf of bread. Now that's just a closet case sugar habit, because 30 minutes later you might as well have taken tablespoons of white sugar from the table. At that point. It turns into that. And even fruit turns into that. And fruit precipitates more bacterial growth than actually sucrose, dextrose, and glucose. Isn't that odd? Why? Because it inherently has bacteria in it. So it precipitates further growth of bacteria. So this is something when you're at Hippocrates we do, of course, but we'd strongly advise you do this every single week the rest of your life. I learned that a long time ago from one of my heroes, Paul Bragg. How many of you know who Paul Bragg was? One of the great health teachers in history. His daughter actually teaches here in our Health Educator program. She's the world's leading iridologist.
Yeah.
Here's some of your favorite things we put up here.
Do not drink soft drinks, hard drinks, energy drinks, or coffee. Rely on pure water, raw juices, including wheatgrass and herbal tea.
One of the sad stories, we had a lovely family from Quebec here. They were all classical musicians. And the kids were all in their very early teens to mid-teens. And we just fell in love with this family. You know, just really supportive parents, really well-adjusted kids, played beautifully. They actually gave concerts to us here. And about a year and a half after they had graduated the program, we found out that the boy died. Beautiful kid. I mean, one of the handsome, beautiful kids was probably 17 years old at the time. And how he died, he didn't drink alcohol. And of course, he's out with his friends, and all of his friends literally are drinking alcohol. So he thought, well, gee, I'll take energy drinks. I'll take energy drinks. And what ends up happening when he took an energy drink, he took a second, he took a third, because his friends kept drinking beer. and ended up overdosing on energy drinks and died. Now, that provoked investigation on my part. In the United States alone, a few hundred children, not only children, but adults, die of energy drinks every single year. How many of you knew that? And they don't take them off the market. They don't take it. Can you imagine what this does to the bloodstream? Can you imagine what this does to the cardiovascular system? Can you imagine what this does to the intestinal system? It's unfortunate, bizarre, and strange. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I mean, if we could somehow teach our kids to get their highs from lifestyle, that would be so much, that would be the best gift that we could give our kids. Like music, teach them sports, get them into hobbies that fills their day, so that this is not needed.
Yeah, we can get them off the damn games that they have in front of their face every single day.
Yeah.
When we wanted to get our kids high, it was very cheap. We just spun them around in circles for about 5 minutes. They got good and high quick.
By eating green, clean, and highly raw, you will support gut balance and mental well-being. Supplementation that is comprehensively created, like Life Give, Restore, Colon, will expedite the resettlement of good intestinal flora.
Now, one of the things that many of the people listening here in the room, as well as out in the world now, don't consider, besides orally consuming probiotic every single day, how about if you're not well? How about if you've taken medicine or chemotherapy or radiation over a period of time, that we don't open a capsule, put it in a bit of pure water, shake it up, and then anally implant the bacteria. This expeditiously grows the immune system. Do you follow? Nothing is quicker, more effective to get that immune system rebounding than putting anal implants of probe and prebiotics inside of it.
So, initially employ enemas and colonics, followed up by a wheatgrass implant. After this is done, dissolve Life Give probiotic in 3 ounces of water, implanting it to be absorbed directly into the large intestine.
See, that's sort of an attractive one.
Yeah.
They have color coordinated there.
Yeah. So for more than 6 decades, we have been focused on intestinal health as the core of well-being. And Wigmore, our founder, taught us well by reversing advanced colon cancer. All other intestinal maladies like hers can be dealt with naturally and effectively.
So one of the things that inspired Anna Marie and I to come and put this together and teach all of you here tonight is that in this room that's named after our founder, we would not be here, none of you would be here tonight, without her reversing colon cancer. And over the time we spent working with her, she actually understood exactly what we're talking about tonight. I will never forget, I was on a plane flying to Vancouver, Canada with her to make a presentation one time. And she said, you know, the bacteria in my intestinal tract is what actually reversed the advanced colon cancer. And I said, did you know it at the time? She said, absolutely not. She said, all I knew is the more vegetables I ate, the more green vegetables I ate, the quicker I was recovering. Because she would periodically go to Mass General, the Harvard hospital, and they were stunned because they started to see a dramatic reversal within a matter of 3 to 4 months when they told her she was going to die in a few months of the colon cancer. And she said, every time I would go, I would be more encouraged and I'd eat more, and it would move quicker than it was before. So before we end and then open for questions, let's give her a big hand and hope she hears us up in heaven. Oh yes, it's wise that everyone drinks wheatgrass and green juice every day.
How much?
To be on the Hippocrates program, if you really say I'm on the Hippocrates program, you're drinking 2 ounces of wheatgrass in the morning, 2 ounces at night. Now there's rare exceptions where somebody may have very weak blood or very advanced disease. We may go 3, very, very rarely 4 ounces twice a day. So 90% of us here, 2 ounces twice a day. Also with green juice, remember, which is one half sprouts, the other half green vegetables. Now, I prefer when I'm at home to make 100% sprouts. I just make 100% sprout juice. You should be drinking a minimum of this size cup twice a day. Now, in Anna's in my life, we drink about 2 liters of it every day. No problem. Matter of fact, it's to your advantage to do it. Yes?
I wasn't sure if it was just part of the cleanse, but you don't advocate fruits at any time?
No, we're not saying we don't advocate fruits. But when people are here in the conquest of the disease, like cancers or viral diseases, or bacterial diseases, or fungal diseases, or yeast problems, there is no fruit in the diet. Why? Because we don't think, we know, because 40 years ago we took fruit out of the diet, that people will not get well in some cases at all with low blood sugar and high blood sugar, or not get well as rapidly with that. Now, when we were the lone wolf speaking about that 4 decades ago, it was hard to get that through the heads of scientists. Today, everyone's on the same page of any value. So, the Stanford University, University of California, Thomas Seyfried, the most important man ever on the subject of cancer. So fruit actually feeds cancer more than does white sugar, sucrose, and dextrose. Because fruit is the only sugar, fructose, that actually metabolizes in the human body like fat. Every other sugar makes you fat, but doesn't metabolize like fat. Goes back to the Warburg work, won a Nobel Prize in 1931, finished the studies in 1924 that showed us if you reduce oxygen by 1/3, that means meat, healthy meat, 1/3, cancer proliferates. So if you're metabolizing fruit sugar like fat, one thing for sure, it's going to reduce oxygen. So beyond the fact that sugar is eaten by viruses, bacteria, mold, yeast, fungus, and cancer, it also heightens the possibility of the mutation because of the reduction of sugar. Now, we know the cheerleaders out there, not the scientists, but the cheerleaders will say, fruit's a natural food. That's absolutely true. That the original diet of man, there's no question anymore, was fruit. And our greens were eaten right at the side of it for healing. Problem is, men messed with this. And it didn't start happening recently, it happened thousands of years ago. And how they messed with it, they realized when they were at the market, the woman or man that sold the sweetest fruit sold the most fruit and always sold it out. And the guy who had the sour fruit didn't sell it. So this goes back millennia. So ever since the beginning of this, when we were fruit eaters, and how we know that to be sure, it wasn't the great universities that taught us that. One of the presentations I've been making around the world in the last year is called The History of Life. And I have a film from an anthropologist that did something surprisingly that nobody else has ever done. He actually tested the teeth of people to see what we really ate. Everyone else has theories. We were hunters and gatherers. We weren't hunters. We weren't hunters. So he actually looked at our ancestors before Homo sapiens. He looked at Homo sapiens, and he looked up to today. Tens of thousands of teeth. He's been looking at this his whole career. And he found out we were fruit eaters and green eaters. And we didn't even eat nuts and seeds and grains and beans. They weren't part of our diet. The only time we ate seeds is when there were long-term droughts. Because how did they know that? They got the geologist to work with the anthropologist, and they actually showed, here's the time there was a 6-year drought or a 10-year drought. Now they started to see indentations of seeds, nuts, grains, and beans on. They never saw bones. They never saw us eat bones. It's a concept. It's a hypothesis. It's not a truth. Now, to further prove this to you, 60% of the world's population today are plant-based eaters. You're in a minority. How does it feel as a white person to be in a minority? So, only 40% of the world's population choose to eat animal-based foods. And who are the sickest people in the world? Look at the brilliant work of my colleague, Dr. Campbell. He was almost thrown out of the field of medicine and science because he came up with the truth. And when he went to the government as the world's, not the world's, the America's leading authority on nutrition, you know who he was? He was the guy that told Americans how to eat. He was so revered by science. He was a top scientist in nutrition. Then he went to the government and basically said, by the way, I've been telling you the wrong thing. We should all be vegans. We should all be plant-based eaters. Could you fund money to do the studies? They said no. He had to go to communist China to get the money. Communist China seemingly cared for their citizens more than America. So he went over there, he appropriated the money. So out of respect, rightfully, he called the studies the China studies and blew all of our minds in the year 1990. Because a lot that he revealed, we didn't know. We didn't know, for instance, dairy food caused more cancer than any form of meat. The second one, meat that causes the most cancer, is not red meat. That always gets the research. It's chicken and turkey. So this is really clear stuff. So to get back to it, we were plant-based eaters. We were fruitarians. We were eating greens for healing. And we started to mess with it. Secondary problem is that 100 years ago, unless you were born to the aristocracy, your family would never eat processed sugar. So our families, any of you are the aristocracy or you don't look it? Your family, your great-grandparents didn't eat sugar. The only people that could afford sugar in those days were the ultra, ultra, ultra rich, the kings, the queens, the princesses. And I don't know, this is a sidebar, but do you realize the entire slave industry happened because of sugar cultivation? There was not slavery before the very, very elite wealthy wanted to eat processed sugar. And they didn't eat much of it. Now today, the poorer you are, the more sugar you eat because government subsidized that industry. And they pour it intentionally into the ghetto. They pour it intentionally into the low. People like us, most of us educated with money, oh, we're wiser. But here are the real statistics. In Europe and North America, the average person who's educated with money, we eat 120 pounds of sugar a year. If you're not educated, it's 160 pounds of sugar a year. No matter what socioeconomic group you come from, your children eat double their weight in sugar a year. Now, what do you think that did to the pancreas? So besides fruit having 30 times, 40 times, 50 times more sugar, now your pancreas, which is supposed to regulate sugar, doesn't work. So this is a big problem. So when people are sick, no sugar. Now eventually a little bit of sugar. We did the work at MIT on that. We found out once you're healthy and stable, 15% of your diet can be ripe, organic fruit. Where are you going to get ripe fruit? Unless you have a tree in your backyard or a shrub. There's no such thing as ripe. You think you go to the Whole Food Market and buy ripe fruit? None of that's ripe. They can't pick it ripe. Keep going.
Well, and there is a book, I forget the author, it's called Fat Chance, and he really tells us about the sugar and the fats. And he even says if you are from the Latin world, you are lacking a gene that helps you digest sugar. So if you look at diabetes rising in those countries, you know you should stay out of all sugar.
So Latinos actually have a bigger problem with it than Anglos.
Yes.
That's interesting. Any of you Latinos here?
Yeah, that's what
you
he's
better really avoid that stuff.
Yeah, because you really have a big problem with it.
It's like Africans, African Americans and Africans with dairy food. One of the great stories on that is my good friend, he's almost like my brother, Dr. Schaller, was a renowned surgeon in Europe, and he switched. He came over to this side. But in his early career, he used to fly in for a month a year to Africa and take care of the starving kids and the starving people. And he did this for like 5 consecutive years. And one day he's in the Jeep going into a village where there's dead children and people starving, and he sees big canvases covering mounds in the desert. And he finally says, pull over, and he opens, and it's condensed milk. And he had enough awareness to realize that some of the sickness he found in the village and even deaths were from them having condensed milk. It wasn't all starvation. It's what we were sending to surplus junk we didn't want. We were sending to them was actually causing their demise and sickness in some cases. Africans, by the way, if you read my book, Dairy Deception, any of you read that book? Dairy Deception, we actually know exactly what happened. There were people in Northern Europe, nobody ever had dairy food, that were starving to death. in the middle of winter. They would watch the sheep and the cow, suckle their babies, and the babies weren't dying. So now you're starving to death. I would do the same thing, by the way. They went over and started to drink milk. And many of them died from that process, but as time, their genetics mutated. So it was only 2,000 people, a tribal group up in Northern Europe, that started to drink milk. First people ever that did that. Isn't that interesting? And now look what happened. Keep going. Any other questions or any other thoughts? Yes?
You mentioned doing the enema and the implants at night. Is there a difference? Do you prefer it at night as opposed to the morning?
The two best times to do enemas and implants are either when you first get up, which has a big advantage too, or at night before you go to bed. We want you to eat. Morning is because you clean as much out naturally and normally after you have a bowel movement, and then taking it up is good. Or at night when you're going to settle and go to sleep is another good time. In the middle of the day it's sort of disruptive and you have to get down and schlock the thing and all of the other stuff.
Morning or night, one is not better than the other.
Well, morning is
Is
preferred.
ideal?
Ideal.
Ideal,
I
yeah.
do
But
morning.
again, whatever you can do.
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're sick enough, doing it morning and night would make sense. If you have liver cancer, pancreatic cancer, bowel cancer, twice a day.
What about uterine cancer?
Same thing. Uterine cancer is lower.
How long does it take to get chemo out of the body?
Chemo comes out relatively quick. Remember, the cells are generating. Within a matter of a few months, you get it out. And we make products for that very purpose. I'm not naive enough to think that most of you are going to make the leap that needs to be made, where you say we don't want it. So you're going to take those things. So in the process of taking radiation and chemo, what we do know is for every one cancer cell you kill approximately 1,000 healthy cells. So why it returns cancer because of doing these things is for what I've just said. So years ago we made a life kit product called Chemozin that protects a large percentage of those 1,000 cells that are dying. And for radiation, Entero rinse. Entero rinse. So now, here's the ideal world. Before you go and subject yourself to these things, 4 days before you take the chemo or radiation, you take it, all during the attack, and then for 4 months afterward. You follow? So you're going to take Chemozin, you're going to take radiation and Entero rinse. Some of you take both, so you have to do both. It's 12 of these capsules a day. And you do it 4 days before, all during the assault, and for 4 months afterward.
And also, usually you end up with PET scan and CAT scans. They can even take a longer time to get out. They are enormously poisonous and an enormous amount of radiation. So you're bombarding your body with that. So I would suggest you take Enterorins for a long time after you take those testing. And there are alternatives to heavy-duty poison testing like that, and that is MRI without contrast, and it's ultrasound, and there's thermography.
Doctors don't make as much money on them, so you don't see that.
But you are the boss. You all have to realize you are the boss. You make decisions, and you should be educated. The educated person that comes to the doctor will have the right things happen.
We've just introduced something brand new here at Hippocrates. If you know anyone in the future that doesn't want to hurt themselves, it's a 3-tier testing on what's called biofilm in the body. Now, of course, in America, we cannot call this a diagnostic tool. This is a very helpful tool for our medical team. And then if you have these different levels, if you don't pass the first one, good. We don't have to do the second test. But if you do pass the first one and get the second test, then we do the third test. And it's a marker that you periodically repeat, systematically, periodically repeat. And now there is a formula that they widely used in Europe that we inject into you, a form of vitamin D that's incredibly, incredibly helpful for what you have and other people are enduring. Matter of fact, as I said today, 57% of us will get cancer in our lifetime.
And a big factor for you would be dairy products that you should not come near, because that's a big factor of why it happened too. Yeah.
So number one cause, dietary cause of all forms of cancer, as Dr. Campbell so well articulated. He said, if you look at the #1 overwhelming cause for lung cancer, we'd say, what is it? Cigarettes. Still today. 75% of the people that get lung cancer comes from cigarettes. We all know that. You don't have to be a doctor to know that. He said, it's more congruent that every form of cancer comes from dairy food, more so than cigarettes being linked to lung cancer. Now, we've known that since 1990. Did your doctor tell you that? And there's nobody that's disputed that. And by the way, our founder was wise enough in 1956 to get rid of dairy food. And I'd ask her periodically, she said, oh, that causes tumors. And we didn't know why. I said, what the hell? She said it, so it must be true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you say chicken and turkey is more
Oh, yeah.
cancerous than...
So meats. So now we're talking about the worst thing was dairy food. The worst meat is chicken and turkey. You may want to read my book, Poison Poultry. Poison Poultry I wrote last year. I talk about a colleague, somebody I got to know, called Dr. Virginia Livingston, who over 65 years did research and published it on exactly what I'm speaking about. And when you look at it, in all poultry, there's a leukemic virus that literally transmutes cells into cells in the body and mutates cells, causing every single form of cancer. So, Poison Poultry tells. And those of you yuppies here that think you're getting organic meat, it's bullshit. There's no such thing as organic meat. And especially free-range eggs and free-range turkeys and chickens. It's completely, absolutely a made-up story by an industry that knows yuppies feel better paying more money being called organic food. There's no such thing. Matter of fact, what we know for sure is that the average percentage of more deaths in the free-range egg factory farms is they die 15% more. Because the poor animal on the top that's not in the cage urinates and the one at the bottom dies. More infected, more sick, etc. Who regulates that? You think the government has? Government doesn't have one employee to look at the poultry or egg industry. It's regulated by who? The industry. And so the same exact factory farm, or the same exact factory farm is there, they have one that's organic is painted on the outside, and the regulation that they've determined they want to make is they open the window in the farm for 30 minutes a day. That's called free range. And so you have this romantic idea that they're out on the hills of California making love and kissing each other. No way. These poor things are crammed in. You're just paying double and triple the money to be shot and killed. Yes?
Does that pertain to the United States, or does it pertain to other parts of the world?
Most of the world gets meat from the United States. So you know that. I mean, just like the Europeans wisely said we don't want genetic modified food, they're getting it anyway. Because they're buying products, commercial products from the United States. But some countries are stricter. Germany's a little bit stricter than here, but not great. You know, the same bullshit goes on in Germany. Just to, my good friend, who's the leading guy in the world on the environmental degradation from eating meat and dairy food, Dr. Oppenlander. You ever listen to Dr. Oppenlander? You've got to listen to this man. He's always been part of our Real Truth About Health conferences. He actually said the amount of meat that is currently being eaten, the amount of dairy that's currently being eaten, we'd have to actually take the entire planet Earth, move all the people off it, all the buildings off it, everything that's built on the Earth, and replicate that 3 times. Just to have animals on land walking all over the place the way you romantically think free-range things are. So we'd have to wipe out the people, get rid of them, have 3 planets to have enough land to have just the meat we're eating today. What happens when we have 15 billion people on the planet? So this is why when we were in England, just 3 years ago, remember the front page of the magazine or the paper that said, Brits must become vegan to sustain life and health. Keep going. Any other questions?
How dangerous is to have a leaky gut, and what is the origin of it, and how to prevent it?
So
How
leaky gut,
dangerous it is to have
how
leaky gut?
dangerous? Well, first it comes from H. pylori. The bad bacteria H. pylori that can cause ulcers and leaky gut. Okay, leaky gut can lead to chronic fatigue, can lead to depression, anxiety, you know, it really comes down to what we've been talking all about today with the microbes and the, second one, and the well-being of what you get in the foods and what you get in the juices. So leaky gut, like if you told me you had leaky gut, I would put you, for example, on something called H. pylori, a supplement that we have. And I would put you on something I call flax water, where I put 2 tablespoons of flax seeds in a big cup of water during the night, stir, let it sit, and drink it first thing in the morning. And, you know, eating 100% raw and staying totally out of fruit, sooner or later is going to kill this bacteria. So it came in because you didn't have enough fiber, you didn't have a good balance of alkaline diet and acidity. So if my diet has tons of coffee and alcohol and meat, sooner or later these guys are going to survive.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
This one's way off.
way off.
So, you mentioned something about sperm.
Yeah.
Could you get cancer from somebody's sperm if they drank a lot or ate bad food? Or?
Up until now, we would have said we don't know or know. The latest research indicates probably. So let's once again repeat what the study out of the University of Massachusetts Medical School said. That you actually, biofrequency-wise, electromagnetically, impose the personality and the biological trait of the father on the fetus. So it's not a stretch or even an imagination to say if the father has cancer, not only biologically, but biofrequency-wise, you're encoding that cancer genetics into the baby. So the answer is yes. Now, if a woman ingests sperm, would that happen? I don't know that. I would assume no, because what's happening is that your digestive fluids and everything else, enzymes, unless you're really, 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 really sick,
Your immune system.
your immune system is going to get down. Matter of fact, sperm actually has a nutritional benefit. Not to say I'm suggesting that for everyone. Well, I can see all the men going home and saying, one of the things we learned at Hippocrates. But your retaliation is throat cancer from cervical cancer. Remember, it's pretty bad that Michael Douglas, the actor, had to train the world that, by the way, from the HPV from women, we end up with throat cancer. And we used to think it was purely an oddity when a man didn't smoke and ended up with throat cancer. Now we know it was from oral sex. The vast majority. Now, that just we've learned in 25 years. We didn't know that 25 years, 26 years ago we didn't know that. So yeah, just like years ago they used to say the only way that you get chronic fatigue syndrome is that intimacy gives you chronic fatigue syndrome. If you're weak enough. If you're strong, you probably won't get it. If you're strong, you won't get cancer. You won't get anything. Keep going. Any other questions? Yes?
I heard about microbiome diet, and they talked about organic bone marrow broth.
It's absolutely ridiculous, stunning stupidity. To think you can take 6 sick animal bones,
No, it's chicken bones.
And beef bones, and boil it, and kill everything in it, and it's going to give you collagen. Yeah, I should also sell you swampland in Florida. This is, I think the disservice that a lot of these people do who are money-oriented people is put a really bad flavor in scientists' brains and minds about natural health care. Because a lot of this nonsense is bananas, I can tell you. If you take anything and cook it at 400 degrees for a long period of time, all you can expect to get from that is a carcinogenic substance. That's for sure. How many of you understand what cooking of food does relating to carcinogens? There's 3 scientifically validated reasons you get them. Number 1, we've known before I was born they knew this, that if you cook any food, I don't care if it's an organic vegetable you cook, you literally now, the oils in the food become carcinogens. Now what organic, natural, plant-based food doesn't have oil in it? None. Every single food has oil, inherently oil. How many of you knew that? About 70 years we've known that. Number two, my wife's country, 35, 40 years ago, said when you cook even an organic grain, doesn't matter. A new substance they discovered called acrylamides come in there, which are known carcinogen. Okay. First everyone balked at, oh, not, it's only the Swedes. Only the Swedes are pretty sharp. Now the Italians blew it out of the water. The Italians did the most impressive. I write about this in my books for doctors, the series on science called Food is Medicine. But then there's a third factor in cooking food that nobody even discusses. And we talk about it a little bit when you talk about meat, but the same thing can happen when you over-bronze something, over-toast something. The carbon factor that we've known for 85 years. If you make something really, really burn like that, there's a carcinogenic effect. Now, can you imagine being on a Louisiana diet, a Creole diet? Everything's fat, everything's burned. And I can imagine that when I looked at the data and statistics of cancer rates in Louisiana versus surrounding, they don't eat the Creole diet, actually 12 to 14% higher. So there's living proof of it. Keep going. Any other questions?
You mentioned a virus in chicken poultry. What was cancer related?
Leukemic virus?
Leukemic virus?
Yes.
Well, look,
And all,
Dr. Virginia Livingston, look up her work. It doesn't only create leukemia, it's called the leukemic virus.
Yeah, many different kinds of cancer.
Every kind.
That's, yeah.
Did you talk about statins and other cholesterol?
Well, we should have Dr. Bob here, our cardiovascular surgeon.
Okay, well, we can talk forever about that.
Okay. There's only about 2 to 3% of the people that statins are valid for. So there are people who statins wouldn't be the worst decision to make. There are other choices, but that wouldn't be bad. That means 97% of the people it's bad for. There is no evidence that statins do what they say. Let's start with that. One of the most heavily prescribed medicines ever in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. There's no long-term evidence that that really works. Number two, it dilutes the blood. So when you dilute the blood, your blood carries nutrition, your blood carries oxygen, your blood carries enzymes and bacteria to the brain, to the heart, to the liver. So what are you doing? So people, why you lose your memory on statin drugs, why you lose your libido on statin drugs, why you lose your way on statin drugs, is because they dilute the blood. Ironically, you go to a doctor, the doctor says, oh, you're on a healthy green diet, you've got to get off the green diet and take statin drugs. Now, smart people, but there's not too many, would say, why don't I just eat the green diet and not take the statin drugs? Wouldn't that be the intelligent question at that point? Of course it would be. Because the green diet, the one we're meant to be on, your body's built for, literally, you don't need statin drugs because your blood is flowing and moving the way that nature wanted it to do. So that's it. The only real exception to that is people who have pacemakers. And by the way, what works, but most people aren't brave enough to do it and doctors won't prescribe it, is vitamin E. If you look at every single study I've ever read, 200, 300 studies on it, vitamin E, natural whole food vitamin E works better than statin drugs. Even if you had a pacemaker. But no doctor's going to be liable and tell you that.
Yeah, and it's there to block cholesterol. So it's blocking cholesterol, which I need. You need block all the gonad hormones, the progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen is made from cholesterol. And if I need to have a patch on my arteries, for example, that's done by cholesterol. It's so many things that it needs to be done. So what happens here, when people go through the 3-week program and they're on Lipitor or Crestor or something, what happens is that they go so low, the doctor have to take them off. Because they
have a stroke. If you stay on a healthy diet and take that, you'll have a stroke.
Yeah, you go so low. So, and that's what happens with diabetes medication. You know, we see it. This is like a living laboratory. We see it here every day. And every guest that goes through a 3-week program will see with themselves and the blood test too what happens. So, like Ron said, there might be a time for certain people to have this medication. Probably 99% never needed it. but they needed a good dietary lifestyle consultation.
Three more questions.
How about getting on the thyroid medication? What are your suggestions for that?
So now you're on Synthroid or levothyroxine, and the thyroid is an iodine-based gland. That's what it needs, okay? So none of them have iodine. And iodine was taken out of salt in the 1970s because we wanted this fancy white salt. And then they said, oops, all these people are getting thyroid problem because we took the iodine out. And the soil got more and more depleted of iodine, so the vegetables, the plant sources didn't have enough either. So then they put iodized salt in the stores. And as soon as you open that box, that evaporates. So you are deficient in that. So iodine would be the first thing. Now there's iodine and iodine. There's toxic iodine. There's iodine that may be just 20% bioavailable. We have a one that's 100% bioavailable that I use myself too every day because I come from the country. My mom, they were a family of 10. They all had thyroid problems, severe thyroid problems. And I just want to counteract that by taking it. Selenium is a good thing. So you can start, you can't just get off your medication. If you were hypothyroid, hopefully within time you'll be off it. If you don't have a thyroid, of course you need to be on medication. But you could move to a more natural, that is a glandular, which is armor or even healthier nature's thyroid.
I tried it.
You tried it?
When you say you tried it, you've got to be cautious. Number one, you have to have a doctor who's conscious.
I was with a nutritionist.
Okay, so what conscious doctors do is they slowly de-escalate the synthroid and they slowly increase the other. There's nobody who cannot tolerate it. It's just how it's done. So reduce and increase.
Yeah, a lot of people come here with Hashimoto, and Hashimoto is a hyper, well, they put on medication and they turn hypo. And then they go from hyper to hypo, and they don't know which leg they're standing on. And you know that they're all wrong treated. Nobody should be on medication for Hashimoto. It's not a normal thyroid problem.
Do you realize that the medical journals now are telling you don't get on medication for Hashimoto? And there's still, almost every doctor we know puts you on medication?
Yeah. So we had, I learned from one of our guests about 20 years ago, he had Parkinson, and he was on Synthroid. And guests have time to sit on the computer and look at Synthroid, because we talk so much about different medication. And he came running to my office and he said, you won't believe it, Synthroid lowers dopamine. I'm taking dopamine for my Parkinson. So we moved him over to Nature's Throid, which is T4 and T3. Synthroid and levothyroxine is only T4. So you're always on one leg.
And by the way, Nature Throid and Armor Thyroid are not vegan.
No.
So sometimes, it's much better choice than Synthroid, and I'd rather have you on that than Synthroid. It's like you're falling and you want us to support you. Synthroid or thyroxine is like Antony and I taking sharp knives and holding you up. Sure, you'll hold up at what cost. If you're falling and we have you on Nature Throid or Armor Thyroid, she grabs one side, I grab another, and we slowly let you come down. It's a big difference.
Yeah, it's a matter of lifestyle. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. I think the whole lifestyle needs to change. It has to do. But I would add some iodine, a few drops. I would add selenium, a few drops. And selenium is a factor in soil that actually is an natural antidepressant. It's a natural, like, what are people taking for
Prozac.
Prozac. It's a natural Prozac. So, and we don't have enough selenium in soil anymore.
2 more questions. Yes.
The chemical that they use on cat scan, would it be similar to the chemotherapy? I mean, the same effect.
Well, if you read the medical journals, the New England Journal of Medicine had a report about 10 years ago where they said that a normal X-ray versus a CAT scan is 1,000 times more radiation than a normal X-ray. How many of you want a normal x-ray? None of us. So if you want 1,000 times more, you take a CAT scan. But what there is a standard of practice. It's not only about economics, there's a standard of practice. So what doctors do is they worry about liability, and if the standard of practice is using a CAT scan, they're going to use that, in spite of the fact they must read the same journals, maybe not, that we read, that say basically this is bad, this is really bad.
It's also taking the radiation now.
Okay, so again, we make something called Entero rinse and another one called Rad Clear, R-A-D clear. So when I'm on planes, I use it. So it's not only if you take radiation, because you get radiation on planes. If I happen to go to New York City and lecture for 3 days, I take it. Los Angeles, London, England, Paris, France, I take it, because you're being radiated at very high levels at that point. So Rad Clear, Life Give, Rad Clear, or Life Give Entero rinse. And by the way, you don't have to be sick or taking drugs to need these things.
And we have another product for thyroid also called Pinnacle.
Pinnacle's amazing.
Yeah.
How many of you know Dr. Marshall, God bless his soul, he died a year ago? Premier Laboratories, Dr. Marshall. One of the good guys. He understood the supplement industry. And Dr. Marshall and I, 15, 20 years ago, created Pinnacle because we realized that 70% of women from teens to 90 have some thyroid problem at this point. It's a plague, it's a modern plague. So we created this one supplement that literally supports it. Now, it doesn't correct it, as does Thywell, as does other things we work, but it stops the breakdown, it stops the movement and degradation of the thyroid. One last question.
It's two-part. Is sea salt got iodine?
No, they don't put iodine and it doesn't have it.
Okay. Unithoid, is that?
Unithoid?
Yeah, for thyroid. It's called unithoid.
I don't know that one. That may be a name that we're not familiar with. Unithoid?
Well, that's what Tom said I should be taking instead of synthroid. Because synthroid has aluminum in it, a little bit of aluminum, and unithoid does.
He may know what they have in Canada, so that may be what you call it in Canada.
Maybe it's like Synthroid, but without fillers or something. Maybe it's similar.
Okay,
You have to go back and ask him with it. I don't know. I'm not familiar with it. Well, thanks for listening tonight.
Yes.
Everyone go. Relax and be well.